Two investigations from the case files of Lieutenant Joe Kenda.
Oh my God!
A chance encounter ends with an active duty soldier dead in the street.
He was actually running from his assailant.
To bring the man justice, detectives must rely on a bizarre clue.
They dropped this.
It says breakdancing contest 1984. Well now.
Then, a hailstorm of bullets rains down on a welcome home party.
What you done on me? My brother was shot. It was very scary.
It's up to Kenda to determine which of the guests had it in for the host.
Richard was trying to do the right thing, coming to the defense of his cousin.
A strong resemblance?
That's him.
You can run, but you're going to have to answer for this. No one deserves to die at someone's hand. Nobody gets to play God. Nobody gets to do that.
It's 1:30 in the morning. Jackie Walda was manning the drive-up window at this fast food restaurant.
Can I take your order, please?
Yeah, can I get an order of fries?
Okay, fries. Right? You want small, medium, or large?
Yeah, can we get 5 large?
Okay, 5 orders of super fries.
Stop and get something to eat.
Drive up to the window, please. Can I take your order?
Yo, what is that guy's problem? What the hell?
Hello, is everything all right?
That's it!
She realized that there's a brawl going on out here.
Hey, you can't do that here! You need to get out of here!
Messed up now!
She's probably thinking, oh great, you know, it's just some more unruly people coming through and nothing that she hasn't seen or dealt with before.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
Well, when Jackie is able to see what's going on, she sees someone lying on the pavement, basically bleeding to death.
Jack! Jack!
Oh my God, help!
Not far away, Lieutenant Joe Kenda is on his way home after an exhausting day on the job.
You begin to believe that, well, maybe we've finally put everyone to rest. Maybe now everybody's satisfied. They've stabbed enough people. They've shot enough people. Maybe they're just going to go to bed. You start to go home and the radio cracks.
Dispatch to 4 Ball 1. Have a report of a stabbing at 375 Academy Boulevard.
10-4, I'll be there in less than 10 minutes.
So maybe they're not done for the day yet. Let's go over there and see what's going on.
Hey, Sarge.
So what we got?
We got a stabbing. Victim is Jack Martinez, 29, pronounced DOA at the hospital.
Well, one heck of a knife fight.
It is rare to have a stabbing result in a dead on arrival. They had to hit something very vital.
Unfortunately, when we got here, it was a ghost town. Just the drive-through cashier, which really didn't see anything. One other person. Victim was actually with another guy during the fight. He got roughed up a bit, so we sent him out of the hospital.
When the police arrive, red lights and siren, everybody runs. They want no part of this. Whether they were involved in it or not, everybody split like a covey of quail.
Now, let's make sure the witnesses don't disappear. Want to point me to where the body was at?
You're gonna love this.
Is that what I think it is?
That's Davidson. It's his 3rd day, first homicide.
The body's now gone, but there's a chalk outline drawn on the pavement.
Let's call him over.
Davidson.
It's your first homicide?
Yes, sir.
As a young officer, so I thought you're supposed to do, no, we're not supposed to do that. They do that in the movies, and they did it in the 1930s, but that was a long time ago. We use photography, measurements, and that sort of thing, so you don't need that.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir.
I ain't got any trouble. You just might want to skip that next time to avoid some grief.
Yes, sir.
You don't yell at them. You just tell them the reality is we don't put the chalk outline around the body. So just keep that in mind.
Now, let me see what we got here.
There are broken beer bottles and rocks and all sorts of things laying all over the place. Obviously, the remains of a large fight.
Where the witnesses at?
We've got them waiting over here.
Just a sec.
Yes, sir.
He was a 20-year-old young man by the name of Matty Marr, who just happened to be walking home from work when this altercation takes place in the parking lot.
You told the officers you saw what happened?
Yeah, it was really weird. They were all in this black Jeep. There was a car right behind them, and they were just honking and honking. That's when we look in that direction. And then all of a sudden, these guys get out of the Jeep, and they just went off on them. It was kind of surreal.
Surreal how?
And they're all wearing the same exact thing.
One thing he vividly remembers is a group of Mexican males, and the way he remembers them specifically is that they were all dressed identically. They had black shirts on and white pants, and you're thinking, okay, are they dressed in costume?
Is this a group of guys from a band at a nightclub, or, why are they all dressed the same?
You think you could identify these guys in a lineup?
I don't know, after that dude got stabbed, they all took off quickly. But they dropped this.
Now, what's that? He pulls out a blue ribbon, and it says, State of Colorado Breakdancing Contest Finalist, 1984. Well, now, here's our matching outfits. They are dancers.
Oh, this is very helpful. Thank you.
Watch criminals act and engage in crime that they're so disconnected, so disoriented, and so stupid that it's almost the same thing as dropping their driver's license at the crime scene. We're not going to go to a ballroom dancing group. We're going to go find the break dancers. We're investigating the death of Jack Martinez, killed during a fight in a fast food restaurant at 1:30 in the morning. One foot in front of the other leads us to a breakdancing group.
Well, this was 1984, and back then breakdancing was very popular. It was something that everybody was doing. So these competitions would come to town, and a lot of people would participate.
Before following up on this lead, Kenda needs to learn more about the victim.
Where are these bones and what did they do? So we do go to the autopsy.
Hey, Doc. Oh, hey, Sergeant. How are you? Good. Have you made any determination on Jack Martinez?
Yes, just getting started on that. Saw several stab wounds, looked pretty deep. If I were guessing, I'd say one of those stab wounds punctured his aorta.
He bled to death in less than a minute. He was dead before the ambulance got there.
Also noticed contusions around his face. Here's the personal effects. It's not much. Check this out.
Jack Martinez has cash on his person, not a great deal, but he does have money, 20-some-odd dollars. This isn't robbery, this is a confrontation. It's a fight.
There was a military ID card, which indicated that he was a soldier, possibly stationed out at Fort Carson.
Why don't you go ahead and take this down to the station? I'm gonna go see if they're ready to release this guy's buddy.
Will do.
This person was identified as a 23-year-old Jeffrey Nostrom, who was also a soldier out at Fort Carson and was very good friends with our victim, Jack Martinez.
I give you guys a minute.
Jeffrey, I'm Sergeant Kenda.
Jack didn't deserve this.
He says, besides being a soldier, Jack comes from a very large, loving family. Here you have a son who's serving his country in the military. And what happens, he gets attacked in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant.
We were just having a good time until all this went down.
Can you tell me how you got to the drive-thru?
They decide that the bars are about to close and that they're hungry, and they go to the fast food outlet, the nearest place that's open that serves food.
What the hell? How long does it take these guys to order? I mean, honestly, this is a fast food place.
Settle down, man. We'll get there. We'll get there.
Well, I'm starving, and they are taking all night, so... Let's go! Come on!
So he just reached over and honked, that's it?
Yeah, I mean, he was being a little rude, whatever. But after that, they went crazy.
Honestly, this is gonna take absolutely forever. All right, you know what? So, come on! Yo, what's up?
Some of them jump on their car, they're pounding it, and it's like all this melee starts all of a sudden.
Like they just ran at us like they wanted to fight, you know? And
that's how you got that?
Yeah. And he messed up my car, too. Like, just because somebody honked.
Did you get a look at him?
Hispanic. They had on white pants and black shirt. It's like they were all waiters or on a team or something, you know.
That's consistent with what the other witnesses are saying. All right, well, I'll be in touch. I'm sorry about your friend.
Early the next morning, Kenda rejoins his colleague, Detective Jones, to follow up with the site of the dance competition.
CSPD, we're looking for the organizer of this event.
Yeah, these guys are like, hey, yo.
Hi, can I help you?
And we meet a woman named Emily Moffat who reports that she was the manager of the competition.
It seems that 4 of the winners of your competition were involved in an incident that we're investigating. We believe they're finalists.
That's just a participation prize. Well, 19X got that.
Would you be able to identify them based on the costumes they had on?
There was a news crew here that taped the entire thing.
She did say, well, wait a minute, though. We do have some news footage. We could take a look at that and maybe help you find these 4 individuals that you're looking for.
Steve, do you have that tape the news crew gave us?
Yeah, I'm fired up.
In the back room of the city auditorium, they had the equipment necessary to be looking at the different contestants, checking for that outfit.
Well, that's not them. They don't fit the description. They were looking for black shirts and white pants.
Wait, that could be them.
Number 7? That's the Robotronic Playboys.
I'm sorry?
That's what they call themselves.
They call themselves the Robotronic Playboys, which I guess if you're 16, that sounds like a great name. And this woman says, I have a list that has all of the names of that group. Now that would be delightful. We've managed to narrow this down very quickly indeed, down to a small group of kids with a stupid name for a dance group, one of whom happens to be a killer. We're investigating the death of Jack Martinez, killed during a fight in a fast food restaurant at 1:30 in the morning. One foot in front of the other leads us to a breakdancing group.
They indicated that these 4 people were identified as Peter Chavez, Alan Cortez, Rob, and Michael.
Your phone numbers, would you?
Most of our dance crews parked in our lot. In order to do that, they had to give us license plate numbers.
Yeah, we'd love to see those receipts.
Excuse me.
She finds a parking receipt for a black Jeep with the name Hector Garcia attached to it.
That was a gold mine. We could run that registration and find out who that vehicle belongs to and where that person lives.
All right, thank you very much.
Armed with the names of the dance team members and the registration of the car they arrived in, Kenda returns to the station.
Hey, Sarge. Ran all those names. Seems like none of them have any kind of a record.
What about the car? Did you run those tags?
Here's the address. Based on those plates, it's like you thought. The owner is Hector Garcia. He's up in Denver.
All right, thank you.
This is something that if the roles were reversed and Denver was looking for somebody in Colorado Springs, they could call us.
We contact Detective Roland, Denver PD. Could he send an officer by at our request to determine if a black Jeep is parked in front of this address?
But when Denver police arrive at the address, there's no sign of the vehicle.
And nobody answered the doorbell. So they decided, well, you know what? We're going to set up a surveillance on this for the next hour or so.
Nothing yet, guys. Still on hold.
And that's exactly what happened.
Gentlemen, I have a visual. This looks like our guy. Go, go, go.
me see your hands.
You Hector Garcia?
Yes?
I'd like to ask you some questions in connection with an investigation being run out of Colorado Springs.
Yes, I know.
Oh, you know. Is this because you're involved in this stabbing?
Let's bring him over here. We have a search warrant to search your vehicle. Search vehicle, please.
We believe we were in the right church and we just found the right pew. They find a switchblade knife. It's a killing knife. It has no other purpose.
We've got Hector Garcia in custody now. We're going to talk to him as quickly as we can. He's going to be the conduit to get us to these other 4 suspects.
I don't think you had anything to do with the killing, but I'm pretty sure you know who did.
They started it.
Excuse me?
The dudes in the car behind us.
It does not matter who started what in terms of the event when there's a death involved. Starting a fight should not be accompanied by a death penalty.
The guys were just complete assholes, so the crew went to take care of it. But I know what happened was wrong, and Peter went too far.
Hector said the knife was all Peter Chavez, not me.
Yo, man, is that blood? Why the hell did you have to stab him?
I didn't even know he put the knife in my car.
All right, I believe you. But the DA isn't as open-minded as I am. He might decide to go a little lighter on you, though, if you help us find your friends, especially Peter.
Okay, yeah, I'll help you guys.
With Hector Garcia's cooperation and the assistance of the Denver PD, all the dance team members are located. All, that is, except for one.
The only one that was not brought in was Peter Chavez.
We obtain an arrest warrant for Peter Chavez. We go to serve it in Denver where he lives. We have Denver PD with us.
Yes.
Is this the home of Peter Chavez?
Yes, it is. What is this about?
His mother answers the door.
Here she had sent her son off to do something he loved. The last thing she ever expected was that he would be questioned by police for a murder.
Sorry, ma'am, there's one more thing. We've got a warrant to search the premises for evidence.
Good Lord.
She is very cooperative, and she remains seated in the living room while we conduct the search.
Is Peter's room down the hall?
Yes, down the hall to the left.
Ma'am, I can't stress this enough. When Peter reaches out to you, and he will, you need to convince him to turn himself in. You don't want us to come looking for him.
I understand.
Detective.
Hector said he wiped the blade on his pants, and there's blood on those pants.
Go ahead and bag him.
That's the final piece of evidence to secure Peter Chavez's conviction for this crime.
We'll be in touch.
Peter Chavez, we're not going to stop until we find him. We are not going to stop.
You're going to put extra police officers on the case to help track down leads of where his associates may be, where his friends may be. All stops are out.
All right, so we've talked to most of the performers from that night. Those who know Chavez don't know where he may be.
All right, thanks. Let's keep plugging away, though.
Officer.
Sir, line 3, you're going to want to talk this guy. It's the detective up in Aurora.
Get a phone call from Detective Hogan from the Aurora Police Department, which is a suburb of Denver.
Peter Chavez has walked into the front lobby of their police building in the company of an attorney to surrender himself on an arrest warrant for first-degree murder for Colorado Springs.
On the advice of counsel, Chavez isn't giving a statement. But later that day, detectives receive test results that bolster their case against Chavez and removes any need for further evidence.
That blood on his pants that he wore during the competition matches the blood of our victim, Jack Martinez.
Between the witness statements and the physical evidence, Ken...
Man, that was a waste of our time. It was. The thing was rigged, bruh.
They receive what they believe is a participation ribbon, and they're right. They don't win anything, and they find this ribbon to be offensive.
Can I take your order, please?
Fries, right?
Yeah, five large.
Small, medium, or large?
Yeah, can we get 5 large?
Okay.
Yo, what's the guy's problem? What the hell?
Yeah, it's gotta be Jack.
Hey, come on. So when they're in line there, they're already frustrated and angry.
Shut the hell up, yo. That's it!
During that fight, Peter Chavez, for reasons known only to himself, takes a switch-bladed knife, puts it in his hand, attacks Jack Martinez from the rear, stabs him 3 times in the back,
Jack Martinez died that night on the pavement of a fast food parking lot.
Jack!
He didn't deserve that.
Unlike Chavez, Hector Garcia, the Martinez brothers, and Alan Cortez are not charged with any crime.
The only thing they did was engage in. Peter Chavez was retained.
He was charged as an adult with murder in this case. But some people would say 4 years for murdering somebody. Was manslaughter a proper charge in this? Probably was. Peter Chavez didn't go from Denver to Colorado Springs that night with the intent to kill anybody. It wasn't something that was planned.
And in the space of less than a minute, a life is lost and a life is ruined. It's hard to imagine that that's the case, but nothing people do surprises me. It often disappoints me, but it never surprises me.
Coming up, a war of words ends in gunfire, and Kenda has to track down the man responsible.
You can run, but you're gonna have to answer for this.
It's a relatively quiet Tuesday night. Dennis Lucio is kind of nodding off in his easy chair, watching the end of a television show.
Mr. Lucio had decided that he was going to collect up his beer cans and take them outside for recycling. And then heard what he thought were gunshots. He looked out and saw a man lying in the street, and a pool of blood was starting to form.
All these people are running around, and his first thought is, get some help here as quickly as possible.
Dennis Lucio calls 911, and patrolmen quickly arrive on the scene. Not far behind them is Lieutenant Joe Kenda.
Hey, Skip. So what do we got?
Richard Posey, age 29. He was shot 3 times, once in the neck. He's still alive, but it's not looking like he's gonna make it.
It's much easier to start off on a large scale with a homicide investigation and then scale it down if it ends up not being a homicide.
Smell that? He might have been hit 3 times, but there are a lot more shots fired than that.
Yeah. And we still have the odor of gunpowder in the air.
I want you to stick around and see who you can talk to. I'm gonna head to the hospital, see if our victim's able to speak.
Yes, sir. Oh, while you're down there, maybe you can make contact with his brother. When officers arrived, he was standing over Mr. Posey. He rode down in the ambulance memorial with him.
Will do, thanks.
The possibility does exist that Richard Posey is able to talk to us. Richard certainly saw the person that shot him and certainly knew why he was shot.
I'm looking for Richard Posey, the gunshot victim.
Yeah, the doctor's room with him now. Should be about another 15 minutes, but his brother's actually just up back there.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Are you Richard Posey's brother?
Yeah.
I'm Lieutenant Kenda.
Rodney King. And I rode with him in the ambulance, and to hear him, you know, don't let me die. You know, I got too much to live for. I told him, you know, God got you. We're gonna, you know, you're gonna be all right. And I'll be honest, I didn't know if he was gonna be all right.
I understand how difficult this is, but we're just trying to find out who did this to your brother. Let's start at the beginning.
Richard just got back to the Springs, and we were throwing him a little party to welcome him.
He wanted to move his family back here and raise his family in Colorado Springs. And so we were throwing a barbecue. We had family and friends. A lot of us was there.
Everybody was having a good time, people in and out.
Yeah, I'm gonna go check out, see what's going on outside real quick.
You know, he was out on the front stoop for a little bit.
Given the time of the year of this party, it would be perfectly logical for people to sort of come and go in and out of the residence.
Is that when the shooting happened?
Nah, I saw Richard come back inside for a little while. It looked like something really bothered him.
Seriously, you think you're... What's up, Rich? Yo, what's up, man? You good? Don't worry, bro. I'm good. I'm good.
You don't look so good, man. You need to relax. Yo, you want another beer?
I said I'm good.
Okay, all right, my bad. Yo, well, you want a beer then? All right, ladies, drinks?
So Richard walked out of the apartment. The next thing Rodney heard was gunshots in the parking lot.
Rich! Rich, hang in there, man. Hang in there. What you doing on me? What you doing? Call the doctor, somebody.
I was just scared to death. I just thought that, you know, I was gonna lose my brother. I wanted to protect my big brother, Richard, like he protected me my whole life.
The guy with the gun ran right past me. But I was just focused on getting to my brother, and then he was gone. I heard him say to his friends, I hope I killed him.
So there are important pieces that Rodney does tell us. We know that our victim, Richard, is upset about something when he comes in the apartment. We also know that the black male in his 20s who flees the area in a black car is likely the person responsible for the shooting.
Excuse me, Lieutenant. The doctor said you can meet with him now.
Okay. We'll keep you updated as this progresses. I'm going to see if your brother saw anything that can help us.
We did receive permission from the doctors to talk to him, although it had to be very brief.
Mr. Posey, I know you're in a lot of pain right now, but I was hoping you had the energy to talk to me for a minute.
Okay.
Do you know who shot you?
No. I just moved here. I don't know his name, but I think my cousin does.
So our victim says that his cousin Dana was in an argument with an unknown person he'd never seen before, and that this person is the one who shot him.
Richard, you know, coming to the defense of his cousin Dana, and that's where the trouble started.
Went inside. I came back out to see if he was gone. He just started shooting.
Lieutenant, it's time.
Okay. Mr. Posey, I'm going to let you rest. I hope you have a full recovery.
Was Dana dating the guy that she was arguing with? Did they have some sort of relationship? Had there been a bad breakup? You know, what exactly led to this argument?
Well, that obviously says that cousin Dana needs to be talked to immediately to find out if she knows who this person was.
Dana Shaw?
Yes.
Could you excuse us for a moment? Yeah, I just got back from the hospital, and Richard said you might be acquaintances with the man who shot him.
Me? No, I've never seen these guys a day in my life.
Dana tells us that she was out front where the party was going on, and she saw a group of people sort of lingering around.
One of those people steps forward and offers her drugs as a way of introduction.
I told him we didn't partake in that and to get out of here.
And, you didn't know any of them?
Well, none of the guys. The girl that they were with, she was familiar. I recognized her from around the neighborhood. She's a dealer. Cheryl Stewart.
Thank you.
So now we have a possible source for the identity of on our list.
Kenda and Arms mine their files for the name Cheryl Stewart. If she's a dealer, as Dana Shaw suggested, then she's likely to have a record.
Bingo.
You got something?
What I have is an arrest warrant for a Shirley Ann Stewart, wanted for the distribution of narcotics. Shirley Ann / Cheryl. It's her AKA, but close enough.
You see it?
Okay, let's send a couple uniforms to her last known address. You got it.
Acting on her outstanding warrant, CSPD officers scoop up Shirley Ann Stewart, aka Cheryl, and deliver her to Kenda's interrogation room.
Look, I told them I didn't sell any drugs.
I don't care about your drug bust.
Then what am I doing here?
We have information that you were a witness or possibly an accomplice to a shooting yesterday. That is what you're doing here.
And you're going to tell us what you know.
And why would I do that?
When we have the leverage because of an arrest warrant, oftentimes we can essentially convince them that it's in their best interest to share information for us, and perhaps we can provide some assistance in dealing with the arrest warrant.
So you can make that go away?
Well, let's just say I know the district attorney.
Okay. He popped that guy. I was there.
And who's he?
Lorenzo. He's my boyfriend.
She immediately says, well, hey, I just started dating him. He is my boyfriend. His name is Lorenzo. He also goes by the name Lo, an abbreviation of Lorenzo. She doesn't know his last name.
You don't know his last name, and he's your boyfriend.
Look, I told you, we just started up.
And that's not too hard to believe. It's a very casual involvement in everyone.
Anyways, he's gone. You're not gonna find him.
He fled town. He's gone. He's not here anymore. He's not here and he's not coming back. That's what she says.
Well, where did he go?
He said he was going home.
Shirley shared with us that Lorenzo was from Oklahoma, Tulsa area, and she believes that is where he went to avoid being picked up here in Colorado Springs.
It's okay, Lorenzo. You can run, but you're not going to be able to hide for very long because we're going to hunt you down in Oklahoma and you're going to have to answer for this. We're investigating the shooting of Richard Posey. The investigation has revealed that the person responsible for this is known only as Lorenzo or Lo, and further that he has fled the jurisdiction on his way to Oklahoma.
Kenda sends Lorenzo's girlfriend Shirley to meet with a resident sketch artist to create a composite image of Lorenzo.
No, his mustache is a little fuller.
Okay, more like that?
Yes, that's him. That's Lorenzo.
Are you positive that's a strong resemblance?
Resemblance? It looks just like a picture of him.
I'll go ahead and fax that to the Tulsa authorities.
Yes, sir.
So that's it? Can I go home now?
Like I explained, I'm not the district attorney.
There's no break. There's none of that. Don't be a criminal. That's your break. We've given you usable advice for your future. But for right now, you're going to jail to face charges that you already obtained before we got interested in you.
It's Kenda.
Hello, Lieutenant. I'm calling from Tulsa County Sheriff's Office. Hey, we got that fact.
Can you help ID him?
Sure can, but y'all have his alias. His real name is Arthur. It's not Lorenzo.
In their opinion, that composite is a clear image of Arthur Williams Jr., but he has a number of aliases to include Lorenzo and Lo.
That's fantastic. Do you think you can locate him?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we can locate him for you.
Am I missing something?
Yeah, he's in our county jail.
Excuse me? He got arrested 2 days after he arrived in Oklahoma for attempted robbery, and he's in custody.
I think God just decided, okay, he's not going to get away with it. Don't worry about it. So I'm real thankful.
Kenda has Arthur Williams Jr. extradited and brought to CSPD headquarters.
They will conduct a small hearing in front of a judge. Most waive their right to extradition hearings and say, yeah, I'll go back, because it's going to happen anyway, whether they want it to or not.
Arthur, I'm Lieutenant Kenda. This is Detective Irons.
Shows you ain't got nothing on me. You don't even know my real name.
Oh, yeah? Well, why don't you inform us?
Larry Williams. I just go by Arthur Lorenzo sometimes.
So who knows who he truly is? Maybe he doesn't know either.
Well, whoever you are, I know you're the person that tried to kill Richard Posey. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, that dude was trying to kill me.
Investigators, Richard went back into the house to get a gun. So Larry said he needed to get a gun, which he did. And then when Richard came back out, he claims that Richard had a gun. And so at that point, Larry shoots him in self-defense.
He said he went inside to obviously get a gun. What's so obvious about him going inside? He lives there.
Larry or Arthur, whatever your name is, I'm done with you. I've got enough to send you away for a long time. And you better pray for Mr. Posey.
Why should I be praying for that dude?
Because if he dies, you're gonna spend the rest of your life in prison. Get him out of my face.
Get up. Put your hands behind your back.
Larry Williams, a.k.a. Arthur, a.k.a. Lorenzo, is taken to jail to await indictment on criminal charges, which thankfully for Richard Posey only rise to the level of attempted homicide.
Miss Kenda, you kidding? He's gonna make it?
Richard Posey is alive by mere chance because Williams had a design to kill him.
My brother, Rodney, he was there. And yeah, I really appreciated that my brother was there. So I believe that God had me all the time. So I give the praises to him. You know, my brother comes second, you know, and he understands that just as well as I do.
At that time, it was a very sad and scary time for us. But now, we've moved on and, you know, but he's here. He's here, he's alive.
With the ballistics results and Richard's testimony, the full story becomes clear.
A toast to my big bro. Finally back in the Springs, where he belongs. Let's turn it up one time.
I remember that day just like yesterday. Well, listen, everybody was drinking that night.
Yo, can we get in your party?
Nah, family only.
Oh, yeah? Well, how about we start a little party of our own then?
Some uninvited guest shows up, one of whom is Larry Williams.
Nah, we good. We don't do that over here.
All right, look, I make serious money off of this. You sure you don't smoke rock? You look kind of high right now.
Whores and bitches make money, too. Which one are you? Seem like a broke-ass bitch to me.
She basically put this guy down, you know, and embarrassed him a little bit.
Who you calling a bitch, bitch?
Whoa, ho. Can I help you?
Mind your...
I couldn't stand there to let some man disrespect her. We all grew up together, so she was like a sister to me.
Look, this is a family affair. I don't know why you're going around calling people names.
Man, get out of my face, man.
Look, I got a better idea. Why don't you and your little posse get the hell up out of here before you say something you regret?
I said it kind of harsh to him. You don't be talking to my cousin like that, you know, so that could trigger him off too, you know.
Seriously, you think you're... What's up, Rich? Yo.
Richard comes in the door and he's very distressed. Williams goes to his car and gets a weapon. Posey collapses face first in the parking lot. Williams walks up to him and shoots him in the back while he's on the ground.
No, hang in there, don't you down me.
And drives out of the area and out of the state to avoid arrest.
Rich, hang in there, don't...
I still got bullets, and the older I get, the more pain I'm having and everything, you know, my life is just not the same.
Larry Williams is tried and convicted of first-degree assault and is sentenced to 10 years in the state penitentiary.
It was supposed to be an ordinary bus ride home. A young man named Tim McLean was 22 years old. He had been working away from home and was now traveling back toward Winnipeg, Manitoba on a Greyhound bus. Around him were strangers doing the same thing people do on long journeys. Some were tired. Some were watching the road through the windows. Some were listening to music. Others were simply trying to make the hours disappear. Tim had no reason to believe that anything was wrong. He had no argument with anyone. He had no enemy waiting for him. He had never met the man who would soon take his life. And yet, somewhere along that journey through Manitoba, Tim sat down beside a stranger. The man beside him was Vince Lee. To the people around them, there was nothing that immediately announced what was happening inside Lee's mind. There was no warning sign that could have told the passengers that something was terribly wrong. There was no obvious confrontation between the two men. There was no personal feud that had been building for days or weeks. There were only two strangers sitting beside each other on a bus. One of them was going home. The other was trapped inside a world of terrifying delusions. And within hours, one of those men would be dead. The date was July 30th, 2008. The Greyhound was traveling through Manitoba toward Winnipeg. The evening was moving toward darkness, and inside the bus, the passengers were settling into the rhythm of a long-distance journey. For Tim McLean, there was nothing remarkable about the trip. He was simply another passenger trying to get where he was going. He had been working in Edmonton in connection with the traveling carnival business and was making his way back toward Winnipeg. At 22, his life was still unfolding. There were places he had not yet seen, things he had not yet experienced, and ordinary plans that had not yet had the chance to become memories. His family knew him as a young man with a future ahead of him. They could not have known that this journey would become the last. Vince Lee moved and took a seat beside Tim. Tim was resting. He was wearing headphones. At some point, he fell asleep. That detail would become one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Tim was not watching Lee. He was not preparing for an attack. He was not fighting. He was asleep. The man sitting beside him was a stranger. There was no warning from Tim's perspective because there was nothing he could reasonably have recognized as a threat. He was simply sitting on a bus, surrounded by people, believing that he was safe enough to close his eyes. Outside, Manitoba continued to pass by. Inside, something was changing. Vince Lee had been suffering from severe mental illness. Later psychiatric assessments would establish that he had schizophrenia and had been experiencing a profound psychotic episode around the time of the killing. His perception of reality had become severely distorted. He heard voices that he believed were connected to God. He developed delusional beliefs about the people around him. And somehow, in that distorted reality, Tim McLean became the focus of those fears. To understand the horror of what happened next, it is important to understand one thing. This was not a conventional murder story. There was no long-standing hatred between the victim and the perpetrator. Dispute. There was no romantic betrayal. There was no history between them that could explain why Tim had been chosen. Tim had simply been there. He was a stranger sitting beside a man whose perception of reality had become dangerously disconnected from the world everyone else could see. At approximately 8:30 that evening, the situation changed without warning. Lee attacked him while he was sleeping. The first moments were sudden and chaotic. Other passengers realized that something was terribly wrong. The bus driver stopped. People began trying to escape from the vehicle. For those passengers, the bus was no longer a means of transportation. It had become a place of terror. The people inside had seconds to understand that they were in danger. Panic spread through the vehicle. Passengers rushed toward the exits, desperate to get away from what was happening. Some tried to intervene, but Lee had a knife, and he threatened those who came near. The passengers were forced to leave the bus and move away from the danger. Outside, they could only watch from a distance. Inside, Tim McLean was dying. The scene that followed would become one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Canadian history. Lee continued attacking Tim after the initial killing, and the body was dismembered. Some remains were found by Lee. Reports from the time also documented cannibalistic behavior. These details are horrifying, but the true significance of the scene was not simply the brutality. It was the behavior of the man who remained inside the bus. Lee did not simply run into the darkness. He did not disappear into the surrounding countryside. He remained inside the vehicle. Outside, frightened passengers and emergency responders waited. The Greyhound became a sealed crime scene, surrounded by police. The passengers who had expected to arrive in Winnipeg that night instead found themselves standing on the roadside, separated from the vehicle that only minutes earlier had been carrying them toward home. Many of them would never again think of a long-distance bus as an ordinary place. For them, the journey had been divided into two lives. There was the life before the attack, when the bus was simply a bus, and there was everything after it. When the police arrived, the situation remained extremely dangerous. Lee was still inside the vehicle, and officers could not simply rush in. The bus had to be contained. The hours that followed were filled with uncertainty. What was happening inside? Was Lee going to attack again? Was anyone else still alive? Could the officers safely enter? Outside the bus, never have imagined when they boarded earlier that day. Eventually, Lee was arrested, and after his arrest, another strange element emerged. He acknowledged what he had done. There was no elaborate attempt to construct an innocent explanation. There was no mystery about the identity of the killer. The police knew who had attacked him. The witnesses knew. Lee knew. The evidence inside the bus would tell the same story. So the central mystery was no longer who had killed Tim McLean. It was why. Why would a man attack a complete stranger who was sleeping beside him? Why Tim? Why in that place? Why with such extreme violence? And what had been happening inside Vince Lee's mind in the moments before the attack? Those questions would eventually take the investigation far beyond the physical evidence inside the Greyhound. They would take investigators into the world of psychiatric assessment, delusions, hallucinations, and a legal question that would divide public opinion across Canada. Could a person commit an act as terrible as murder and yet not be criminally responsible for it? That question would become the center of the case. But before the courtroom, before the psychiatric examinations, before the arguments over responsibility and public safety, there was a young man named Tim McLean. That is where this story is famous. There is a danger that the victim can slowly disappear beneath the headlines. The public remembers the killer. They remember the shocking details. They remember the courtroom. They remember the legal controversy. They remember the psychiatric diagnosis. But Tim was not a headline. He was not a legal question. He was not a case number. He was a 22-year-old man who had boarded a bus expecting to reach his destination. He had a family. He had people who knew his face, his voice, his personality, and his habits. He had a life that existed long before the night of July 30th, 2008. And that life was reduced to a final journey that he never completed. The tragedy becomes even more difficult to comprehend because nothing about Tim's decision to take that bus appears extraordinary. There was no dangerous meeting arranged in advance. There was no isolated location where he knowingly placed himself at risk. He was traveling in a public vehicle. There were other passengers around him. He was surrounded by people. And still, in the middle of that ordinary journey, the world around him became something unimaginably dangerous. For Tim, there was no opportunity to understand the nightmare developing beside him. For the other passengers, there was no time to prepare. And for the investigators who arrived, would take years to answer. One of those questions concerned Vince Lee himself. What had happened to his mind before he boarded that bus? Psychiatric evidence would later reveal that Lee had been experiencing serious mental health problems. People who knew him had noticed troubling changes before the murder. He had shown signs of psychological disturbance and had been encouraged to seek treatment. But warning signs do not always look like warnings when viewed in real time. A person can appear unusual without appearing dangerous. A strange belief may seem like a private problem. An anxious conversation may seem insignificant. A person withdrawing from others may simply appear troubled. And only afterward, when investigators reconstruct the days and weeks leading up to a tragedy, can those details acquire a frightening new meaning. The same thing happened here. The investigation would eventually reveal that Lee's mind had been constructing a reality that was very different from the one surrounding him. He believed he was hearing voices. He believed those voices were connected to God. He developed delusional ideas about Tim. In the reality created by his psychosis, Tim was not simply a sleeping passenger. He was perceived as something dangerous, something that had to be stopped. That distinction would become central. The act looked incomprehensible. A young stranger asleep on a bus had been attacked by another stranger. But inside Lee's mind, according to the psychiatric evidence later presented, the situation had been transformed into something completely different. That does not lessen what happened to Tim. It does not erase the violence. It does not undo the suffering of his family. It does not make the night of July 30th disappear. Instead, it creates a second tragedy layered over the first. One man lost his life. Another man's mind had become so distorted that he committed an act he might never have committed while experiencing reality normally. And an entire community was left to wrestle with the consequences. The Greyhound case would eventually become one of Canada's most closely watched examples of the legal concept known as not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder. But on the night itself, there was no courtroom. There was no legal argument. There was no psychiatric report. There was only a bus stopped on a Manitoba highway. There were passengers standing outside. There were police officers surrounding the vehicle. And inside that bus was the body of a young man who had begun the evening expecting nothing more than a trip home. Tim McLean's final hours were over. But the questions raised by his death would debate what justice means when the person responsible for a killing is suffering from severe mental illness. The courts would examine Lee's mental state. Psychiatrists would attempt to reconstruct the reality inside his mind. The family of Tim McLean would have to live with a loss that no legal decision could reverse. And the public would be forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most difficult criminal cases are not difficult because we do not know what happened. They are difficult because we know exactly what happened, yet the answer to what should happen next is far less certain. On that July evening in 2008, Tim McLean had no way of knowing that the stranger beside him would become the center of a national debate. He had no way of knowing that his name would one day be associated with questions about schizophrenia, criminal responsibility, psychiatric detention, and public safety. He was simply trying to get home, and that is what makes the beginning of this story so painful. Nothing about Tim's journey needed to be extraordinary. It should have ended with him stepping off a bus. It should have ended with him seeing familiar faces. It should have ended with a door opening, a bag being carried inside, and another ordinary night beginning. Instead, the journey ended in unimaginable violence. The road continued toward Winnipeg. The bus stopped. Police arrived. And somewhere between one ordinary stop and the next, the life of a 22-year-old man came to an end. What happened inside that Greyhound would soon become known across Canada. But before the headlines, before the courtrooms, before the psychiatric debate, there was only Tim McLean, a young man on his way home, a stranger beside him, and a few final, ordinary moments before everything changed forever. The most frightening thing about the journey was not that Tim McLean had knowingly placed himself in danger. It was that he had done nothing unusual at all. There was no reason for him to look over his shoulder. No reason to study the man sitting beside him. No reason to imagine that the stranger sharing his row had already begun seeing the world through a completely different reality. Tim was 22. At that age, the future usually feels larger than the past. There are still roads you have not traveled, cities you have not visited, people you have not met, mistakes you have not made, and memories that have not yet happened. A long bus journey can feel like nothing more than an inconvenience between one part of life and another. For Tim, the Greyhound was supposed to be exactly that, a passage between places. He had been away from home working in the carnival business, and now he was traveling back, time on the road. Like so many young people who spend their lives moving from one temporary place to another, he was accustomed to buses, highways, unfamiliar faces, and long hours watching the landscape change through a window. There was nothing about that night that should have separated it from all the others. Until Vince Lee sat beside him. Lee was not a man Tim knew. He was not someone Tim had argued with. He was not someone Tim had rejected, insulted, or threatened. There was no history connecting the two men. That absence of history would become one of the most disturbing facts in the entire case. Because investigators searching for motive normally begin with relationships. They ask who hated the victim, who owed the victim money, who wanted revenge, who had been threatened, who had been betrayed, who had something to gain. In the case of Tim McLean, those familiar questions led nowhere. There was no conventional motive. There was only a stranger. And behind that stranger's eyes was a mind that had begun to separate itself from ordinary reality. Vince Lee had been experiencing serious psychiatric problems before the murder. Later examinations would establish that he suffered from schizophrenia and had been in a profound psychotic state at the time of the attack. But on the bus, none of the other passengers had access to hearing. They could not see the delusions taking shape in his mind. They could not see the invisible threat that Lee believed surrounded him. They saw a man, a passenger, a stranger, perhaps tired, perhaps quiet, nothing more. That is one of the most unsettling aspects of cases involving psychosis. The most dangerous part of a person's reality may be completely invisible to everyone standing outside it. A person can look at an ordinary seat on a bus and see a threat. A person can look at an ordinary stranger and see an enemy. A person can hear a thought and experience it as a command coming from somewhere outside themselves. And when that distorted reality becomes more powerful than the physical world around them, ordinary actions can suddenly acquire extraordinary meaning. That appears to have been what happened inside Lee's mind. According to psychiatric evidence later presented in court, Lee believed that he was receiving messages from God. He believed that voices were communicating with him. His thoughts became increasingly dominated by fear and delusion. And Tim, who was simply sitting beside him, became trapped inside that distorted perception. There is something especially tragic about the fact that Tim was asleep, vulnerable, and least aware of the world around them. On a bus, surrounded by strangers, people often assume that the presence of other passengers provides a certain measure of protection. Someone is nearby. The driver is ahead. There are cameras and lights and other people. The vehicle is moving through a populated country. The journey feels public. Safe enough. Tim had every ordinary reason to believe he could close his eyes. And when he did, he had no idea that the man beside him was entering a psychological crisis. The distance between normality and catastrophe was measured not in miles, but in moments. Around 8:30 that evening, everything changed. The attack came suddenly. The passengers did not have time to understand what they were seeing. One moment they were travelers. The next they were witnesses. The drivers stopped the bus. People began trying to escape. Some passengers attempted to move toward the scene, perhaps believing they could help. But the danger was immediately clear. Lee had a knife. He threatened anyone who approached. The instinct to help another human being collided with the instinct to survive. The passengers withdrew. They got off the bus. They moved away. And behind them was Tim. Must have felt impossible to comprehend. They had boarded a Greyhound expecting an ordinary trip. Now they were standing on the roadside while a man remained inside the vehicle with the person he had attacked. The bus, which had been a shared public space only minutes earlier, had become a sealed environment of terror. The passengers could not simply walk back inside. They could not safely reach Tim. They could not know exactly what Lee was doing. All they could do was wait. The police would soon arrive. But time behaves differently during an emergency. A minute can feel like an hour. A few seconds can feel endless. For the people outside the Greyhound, every movement inside the vehicle carried the possibility of another tragedy. For Tim, there was no more escape. And for Lee, the world inside the bus had become something that only he could understand. The police eventually surrounded the vehicle. The situation became a standoff of sorts, with officers forced to approach carefully because Lee remained inside. The surrounding area became a crime scene. The passengers became witnesses, and the Greyhound itself became the physical center of a case that would soon shock the entire country. When Lee was finally taken into custody, investigators were faced with a terrible but seemingly straightforward fact. They had the scene. They had the accused. But as the first stages of the investigation unfolded, another reality began to emerge. This was not simply a question of violence. It was a question of perception. What had Vince Lee believed was happening? What had he thought Tim was? Why had he chosen this particular passenger? And what was happening inside his mind during the moments before, during, and after the attack? Those questions mattered because Lee's behavior after the killing was unlike the behavior investigators might expect from a conventional murderer attempting to conceal a crime. He did not simply disappear. He remained at the scene. When arrested, he acknowledged what he had done and reportedly expressed a desire to die. The more investigators learned, the less the case resembled a conventional murder investigation. The evidence pointed toward something much stranger. A mind in crisis. A belief system disconnected from reality. A man convinced that he was acting against a threat that did not exist in the physical world. And a victim who had unknowingly become the center of that delusion. The investigators now had two stories to reconstruct. The first was the physical story, where the passengers had been sitting, where Tim had been, where Lee had moved. When the attack began, he secured the scene. How Lee was arrested. The second story was invisible. It existed only inside Lee's mind. What did he hear? What did he believe? What did he think would happen if he did nothing? And could anyone have recognized what was happening before the violence began? Those questions would eventually become more important than the question of guilt itself, because there was never much dispute about whether Vince Lee had caused Tim's death. The central issue would become whether the law could hold him criminally responsible for an act committed while he was experiencing a severe psychotic disorder. That distinction would eventually lead to one of the most controversial verdicts in Canadian criminal law. But before the court heard psychiatric testimony, there was a family receiving the news that every parent fears. Tim was not coming home. Somewhere between the last ordinary moments of his journey and the horror that followed, his future had disappeared. His family would later have to confront not only the fact that Tim had been murdered, but also the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the person responsible. They would hear words like schizophrenia, psychosis, delusion, mental disorder, not criminally responsible, words that belonged to doctors and lawyers, words that attempted to explain something that none of those words could answer the simplest question a grieving family carries. Why him? Why did this happen to Tim? Why did an ordinary journey end like this? And why was the stranger beside him able to see something in Tim that was never there? The tragedy of Tim's death is that the answer could not be found in anything Tim had done. There was no secret relationship, no hidden feud, no dangerous decision that could explain the attack. He had simply been in the wrong seat beside the wrong person at the wrong moment. And that randomness makes the case even more disturbing. Most people want to believe that terrible things happen for a reason. We want causes. We want warning signs. We want patterns. If we can identify what caused the danger, perhaps we can avoid it ourselves. But sometimes there is no satisfying pattern. Sometimes an innocent person is simply present when another person's reality collapses. That was Tim's tragedy. And it was also the beginning of Canada's long examination of Vince Lee. The country would eventually have to confront a question that had no comfortable answer. If Lee truly believed he was protecting himself from a supernatural threat, if his perception had been shattered by psychosis, if he genuinely could not understand the moral and legal reality of what he was doing, imprisoned? Should he be treated? Should he be isolated indefinitely? Could he ever become safe enough to return to society? And who should make that decision? The answers would not come all at once. They would unfold through psychiatric examinations, courtroom testimony, and years of review. For the public, however, there was one fact that remained constant. Tim McLean was dead. Nothing could change that. No diagnosis could return him. No courtroom could undo the attack. No psychiatric treatment could give his family back the years they should have had with him. The law could determine what happened to the person responsible. It could determine whether he was criminally responsible. It could determine where he would be held and under what conditions. But it could not restore the life that had been taken. And so, while Canada debated the meaning of responsibility, the story of Tim remained painfully simple. He was 22 years old. He was traveling home. He sat beside a stranger. He put on his headphones. He closed his eyes. And for a brief moment, everything was ordinary. That was the last ordinary moment of Tim McLean's life. The journey ahead would not end in Winnipeg. It would end on a Manitoba highway, beneath the harsh reality of a crime that who had been sitting quietly beside Tim would soon become one of the most recognizable names in Canada's debate over mental illness and criminal responsibility. But before Vince Lee became a defendant, before doctors examined his mind, before lawyers argued over the meaning of responsibility, he was simply the stranger sitting beside a sleeping young man. And Tim had no reason to know that the stranger's mind was already at war with a reality that only he could see. That was the danger. Not a visible weapon. Not an announced threat. Not an argument. It was a private world inside another human being, growing darker, while everyone around him continued believing that this was just another bus ride home. And by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late. By the time the Greyhound bus entered Manitoba, Tim McLean had already been traveling for more than a day. The journey had begun far away in Edmonton. For Tim, the road was familiar territory. He worked with traveling carnivals, a life that could take him from one town to another, from one temporary fairground to the next. There was something restless and youthful about that kind of existence. Work was never completely tied to one place. Home could be a city waiting at the end of a bus route, while the next job might be Winnipeg. The bus was moving east. Outside the windows, the landscape stretched away into the darkness. Manitoba is a province where distance can feel enormous. Roads can continue for miles with little more than fields, trees, signs, and the occasional settlement breaking the horizon. At night, the darkness outside the windows becomes almost complete, leaving the passengers inside their own small, illuminated world. The Greyhound was that world. Rows of seats, travel bags, headphones, quiet conversations, people trying to sleep, people waiting for the next stop. Nothing about it suggested that the vehicle would soon become the scene of one of the most shocking crimes in modern Canadian history. Tim had chosen a seat near the back, one row ahead of the washroom. It was an ordinary choice. There was nothing strategic about it. He was simply another passenger settling into a long journey. But there was another passenger on the same bus whose movements were becoming increasingly difficult to understand. Vince Lee had boarded the Greyhound earlier in his journey. By the time the bus reached Manitoba, his behavior had already begun to attract attention from some people around him, although nobody could have understood what those behaviors would eventually mean. Time moving through Canada, and his mental state was deteriorating. What makes his story particularly disturbing is that the signs were not necessarily obvious to everyone who encountered him. A man sitting quietly on a bus does not automatically appear dangerous. A man who changes seats does not automatically appear dangerous. A man who talks to another passenger does not automatically appear dangerous. A man who seems distracted or distant may simply appear tired. But later, investigators would reconstruct Lee's movements and examine the events that occurred before the attack. Those details would provide a glimpse into a mind that was already becoming detached from ordinary reality. The day before the killing, Lee had been in Erickson, Manitoba. He had gotten off the bus and spent the night near a grocery store. A witness later recalled seeing him sitting upright during the early morning hours, his eyes wide open. The image is difficult to forget. A man sitting alone through the night. The town around him quiet. The darkness gradually giving way to morning. And Lee apparently unable to sleep. The following morning, he sold a recently purchased laptop computer to a teenager for a small amount of money. When investigators later examined the computer, they found a strange collection of material, including numerous job applications connected to convenience stores, fast food restaurants, information technology positions, even the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. There were also photographs. Some were ordinary travel photographs. Others were images of mountains and aircraft. There were pictures that suggested Lee had been moving through Canada without a clear sense of stability. These details would later be examined as part of the attempt to understand what had been happening to him. But at the time, none of this was connected to Tim. Tim was still simply traveling home. At approximately 6:55 in the evening on July 30th, the bus left Erickson. A new passenger was on board, Vince Lee. He initially sat closer to the front. There was another passenger near him, a woman named Stacy, who was a coworker of Tim's. According to later reporting, Lee spoke with her for nearly an hour. They talked during the journey. They even smoked together during a rest stop. Nothing about that interaction appeared to predict what would happen next. And then Lee changed seats. He moved toward the rear, toward Tim. That movement would later become one of the details that haunted people who knew Tim. Was it random? Was Lee searching for someone? Was there something about Tim that attracted his attention? Or was the movement simply of a man whose thinking was already dominated by delusions? The answers would never be completely satisfying. What is known is that Lee eventually sat beside Tim. Tim barely acknowledged him. Then Tim went back to what he had been doing before. He listened to his headphones. He leaned toward the window, and he fell asleep. That tiny moment contains the entire tragedy in miniature. Tim did not know the man beside him. He did not know what Lee had been thinking during the previous hours. He did not know that Lee's mind was becoming increasingly dominated by voices and delusions. He did not know that the person sitting inches away from him would soon attack him. There was no dramatic confrontation, no argument, no raised voices, no exchange that might have alerted the rest of the passengers. The bus simply continued east. The highway stretched ahead. The passengers remained inside their private worlds. And Tim slept. For a while, everything remained quiet. Then Lee pulled out a large knife. The attack began suddenly. Witnesses later described how Lee stabbed Tim repeatedly while he was still wearing his headphones. The violence was so sudden that the other passengers had only moments to react. People screamed. The driver immediately was stopped. The doors were opened. Passengers began to flee. The instinct was simple. Get outside. Get away. Survive. Some people did not immediately understand what had happened. Others saw enough to know that they could not remain inside. The driver and two other men attempted to help Tim. That decision required enormous courage. They were facing an armed man inside a confined vehicle. But they tried. Lee drove them back. He threatened them with a knife. The bus doors became a barrier between the rescuers and the victim. The passengers were forced away from the vehicle. And then the bus became almost completely isolated. Inside were Lee and Tim. Outside were the survivors. For the people standing on the roadside, the next moments must have seemed unreal. The same vehicle that had carried them peacefully through Manitoba had suddenly become a place they could not safely enter. They could see the bus. They could see movement inside. But they could not reach Tim. The driver and others had effectively trapped Lee inside. The emergency immobilizer prevented the bus from simply being driven away. The passengers gathered outside, frightened and confused. Some were crying. Some could only stare. The police were called. The RCMP response began. At approximately 8:30 p.m., the Portage La Prairie RCMP received the report of the stabbing. Officers moved toward the scene. By the time they arrived, the situation was no longer simply an assault. It was a barricaded suspect situation involving a homicide. And the officers had almost no idea what was happening inside the bus. They could not safely rush the vehicle. They had to establish control. They had to protect the passengers. They had to determine whether there were other victims. And they had to find a way to take Lee into custody. The darkness of the Manitoba highway made the scene even more surreal. A Greyhound bus stood stopped along the road. The passengers who had been traveling together were now scattered outside. Police vehicles surrounded the area. The people who had been strangers only hours earlier were suddenly united by the same terrifying experience. They had all seen something. They all carried fragments of the same nightmare. And somewhere inside the bus, Lee remained. As the standoff developed, police were able to see disturbing movements through the windows. Lee moved around the bus. At times he appeared to pace. At other times he returned. The situation was not under control. They summoned negotiators and a tactical unit. The priority was to contain Lee without exposing officers to unnecessary danger. The passengers had already escaped. The remaining objective was to secure the bus and arrest the suspect. But the hours were passing. The crime scene was becoming more horrifying with every minute. Lee's behavior was so strange that investigators could not understand it through the normal framework of a murder. A conventional killer might attempt to flee. A conventional killer might hide evidence. A conventional killer might negotiate for escape. Lee appeared to be operating according to an entirely different logic. At one point, he told police that he had to remain on the bus forever. Those words would later become one of the clues to his psychological state. He was not simply trying to escape. He seemed convinced that something required him to remain there. The police waited. The passengers waited. And Tim's family had not yet fully understood what had happened. There is a particular cruelty in the passage of information after a sudden death. At first, there are only fragments. There has been an incident. Someone has been injured. There is a police response. Something serious has happened on a bus. Then the fragments become clearer. A passenger has been attacked. Tim McLean. For a family, the moment when a stranger's name becomes the name of your son is impossible to prepare for. Tim's friends would later describe him as an easygoing young man, someone who did not look for trouble, someone who had not been known for violence. A friend who had known Tim since grade 7 would later say he could not remember Tim ever getting into a fight. That image of Tim stood in painful contrast to the brutality of his final moments. The man who had been killed was not known as someone who lived dangerously. He was not involved in a feud. He was not searching for confrontation. He was simply traveling. That made the crime even harder for those who knew him to understand. The question became unavoidable. Why Tim? What had he done? The answer, as far as the evidence would later show, was nothing. There was no established relationship between the two men. No personal conflict. No conventional motive. Tim had simply become the focus of Lee's distorted perception. That distinction would eventually become central to the psychiatric case. But on the highway that night, nobody was thinking about legal standards. Nobody was discussing the definition of criminal responsibility. Nobody knew how the courts would eventually interpret Lee's, waiting for the police to make the situation safe. The officers were waiting for the right opportunity. And inside the bus, the man responsible for the killing remained trapped. Hours passed. Then, sometime after midnight, the standoff reached its final stage. Lee attempted to break through a window. Police moved in. He was taken into custody. The long night was finally ending, but the scene left behind was almost impossible to comprehend. Evidence was recovered from inside the bus. Investigators began photographing and documenting the vehicle. The passengers were taken to the RCMP detachment in Brandon to be interviewed. They had survived. But survival did not mean they had escaped the night unchanged. They had seen a young man attacked without warning. They had fled a bus that had suddenly become a place of death. They had spent hours watching police surround the vehicle. And some of them had seen things that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The following day, Greyhound representatives helped the passengers replace clothing and belongings that had remained on the bus. The travelers eventually continued toward Winnipeg. But their journey was no longer the journey they had begun. The bus would continue to exist as evidence. The highway would remain part of the case. And then the police investigation moved rapidly. On August 1, 2008, RCMP officially announced that a 22-year-old man had been murdered on a Greyhound bus traveling eastbound on Highway 1 during the evening of July 30th. Vince Wagwong Lee, 40 years old and from Edmonton, had been arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The public now had a name for the accused. But the victim's name was initially withheld by police. That meant that, for a short time, the country knew about the horror, but not about the young man whose life had been taken. Then the identity of the victim became known. Timothy Richard McLean, 22 years old. A carnival worker. A son. A friend. A young man on his way home. And suddenly the story became more than a shocking crime. It became a personal tragedy. People who had known Tim began talking about him. They remembered his laugh, his personality, his easygoing nature. The people who loved him did not see a headline. They saw Tim. And that is where the story must pause. Because before the legal questions begin, before psychiatrists examine Vince Lee, before the Crown and defense lawyers stand before a judge, there is a simple truth that cannot be changed by any theory of mental illness. He expected to reach Winnipeg. He expected another day. He expected another morning. He expected the ordinary future that belongs to a 22-year-old. He did not get it. The stranger beside him carried a reality that Tim could not see. And for Tim, there was no warning. There was no chance to understand. There was no chance to run. There was only the quiet of a bus journey, the glass of a window beside his seat, headphones covering his ears, and the assumption that the stranger sitting next to him was simply another passenger. Then the world changed. In the aftermath, investigators would begin asking what had happened inside Vince Lee's mind. They would discover a history that stretched beyond the Greyhound. There had been strange behavior. There had been voices. There had been episodes of disorientation. There had been a growing separation between Lee's perception and the physical world around him. And eventually, the case would reveal something even more disturbing. The attack on Tim was not simply the result of uncontrolled rage. According to the psychiatric evidence, Lee believed he was responding to a threat that existed only within his psychotic reality. To him, Tim was not simply Tim. He had become something else, something Lee feared. Something would become the key to understanding what happened on the Greyhound. It would also become the key to understanding why this case would not end with a conventional murder conviction. But that chapter belongs to what came next. For now, the highway had gone quiet. The Greyhound had stopped. The passengers had escaped. The police had taken the suspect away. And a 22-year-old man who had boarded the bus expecting nothing more than a journey home was gone. His family would spend the years that followed trying to make sense of a death that made no ordinary sense. The country would debate whether justice had been served. Psychiatrists would study the mind of the man who killed him. Courts would examine the boundary between mental illness and criminal responsibility. And Tim's name would remain attached to one of Canada's most haunting questions. What happens when a human mind becomes so detached from reality that it transforms an innocent stranger into an imagined enemy? There is no simple answer, but there is one thing that should never be forgotten. Before Tim became the victim at the center of a legal debate, he was simply a young man trying to get home. And the last person he expected to fear was the stranger sitting beside him. Manitoba is a province where distance can become part of the story. A road can continue for miles with little interruption. Towns appear long stretches of highway. For someone traveling by bus, the landscape outside the window can become almost hypnotic. The destination is still far away, but the vehicle keeps moving, carrying strangers who may never see one another again after the journey ends. On July 30th, 2008, one of those journeys was taking place aboard a Greyhound bus traveling toward Winnipeg. Among the passengers was a 22-year-old man named Timothy Richard McLean, Jr. Tim was returning toward Winnipeg after spending time working in Edmonton in connection with the traveling carnival business. His life had already involved movement. The carnival world was not the kind of work that kept a person permanently rooted in one place. Work could mean traveling, packing up, moving on, arriving somewhere new, and eventually making the journey back again. For Tim, the Greyhound was simply another part of that life. There was nothing unusual about being on a bus. There was nothing unusual about traveling with strangers. There was nothing unusual about being tired after time on the road. And there was certainly nothing unusual about wanting to sleep. The Greyhound was a public space, but it was also an enclosed world. Once the doors closed and the vehicle began moving, the passengers were temporarily bound together by the same route. They might have come from completely different futures, but for those hours they shared the same narrow aisles and rows of seats. The driver was at the front. The passengers sat behind him. The highway stretched ahead, and the bus kept moving. Tim was seated toward the back of the vehicle, near the washroom. It was an ordinary place to sit on a long-distance bus. There was no indication that this particular seat would soon become the center of a national tragedy. The people around Tim were strangers. Some had probably exchanged only a few words with one another. Some may have been watching the road. Some may have been thinking about home. Some were probably thinking about work, family, money, plans for the next day, or nothing in particular at all. A bus journey creates this strange temporary community. People are physically close, but emotionally separate. They share the same space without necessarily sharing anything about their lives. A person sitting a few seats away can remain completely unknown. That anonymity was part of what made the events of July 30th so difficult to understand. The man who would eventually kill Tim was not someone from Tim's past. He was not a former friend. He was not a business associate. He was not a relative. He was not someone with whom Tim had a known dispute. He was simply another passenger. His name was Vince Lee, as part of his own journey through Manitoba. At the time, however, something very different was happening inside his mind. Later psychiatric evidence would establish that Lee suffered from schizophrenia and was experiencing a severe psychotic episode around the time of the killing. He heard voices that he believed were connected to God, and he developed delusional beliefs about people around him. But none of that was visible in the ordinary way. The passengers did not have access to Lee's thoughts. They could not see the voices he believed he was hearing. They could not see the private reality that was forming inside his mind. To everyone around him, he was simply another traveler. That distinction matters because the physical setting of this case was so ordinary. There was no abandoned building, no isolated cabin, no dark alley, no hidden room. The crime occurred in one of the most ordinary public environments imaginable, a bus carrying passengers along a major highway. That is what makes the setting so unsettling. A place designed to move people safely from one destination to another became the scene of a murder that would remain in Canada's collective memory for years. Before the attack, however, the Greyhound was still functioning exactly as passengers expected. The vehicle moved toward Winnipeg. The journey changed seats and moved toward the back of the bus. He eventually sat beside Tim. This movement would later become an important part of the reconstruction of the night. There was no evidence of a personal relationship between the two men. There was no known argument. There was no confrontation that would explain what followed. Tim was simply there. And eventually he fell asleep. He was wearing headphones. His attention was turned away from the man beside him. The setting could not have been more ordinary. That is important because the horror of this case did not begin with an obviously dangerous environment. It began inside an environment that people normally associate with routine. A person boards a bus. They find a seat. They put their belongings down. They look through the window. They listen to music. They close their eyes. They wait for the destination. The mind expects continuity. The next stop should arrive. Then another. Eventually the bus should reach Winnipeg. Tim's journey should have followed that pattern. But the man sitting beside him was experiencing a completely different reality. According to the evidence later presented by psychiatric experts, Lee's mind had become dominated by delusions. He believed that he was receiving messages. He believed voices were communicating with him, and in the distorted reality created by his psychosis, Tim became associated with that threat. The physical world remained unchanged. The bus was still a bus. The seats were still seats. The passengers were still passengers. The highway was still the highway. But Lee's interpretation of that world was no longer the same as everyone else's. This difference between the physical environment and a person's internal reality would become one of the central themes of the case. Outside Lee's mind, Tim was a 22-year-old passenger. Inside Lee's psychotic perception, Tim had become something else. A danger. A perceived threat. A figure associated with delusional beliefs that had no basis in the physical reality around them. That distinction would later be examined by psychiatrists and by the court. But at that moment, none of the passengers knew that such a struggle was taking place inside the man sitting among them. The bus continued. The hours of the journey accumulated, and Tim slept. The ordinary setting makes the next sequence particularly difficult to comprehend. Around 8:30 in the evening, Lee attacked Tim. The transition from routine to catastrophe happened almost instantly. There was no extended passengers enough time to prepare. The attack was sudden. The passengers reacted in confusion and fear. The drivers stopped the bus. People began trying to get away from the immediate danger. The vehicle that had been carrying them toward Winnipeg was suddenly no longer a place they could safely remain. The passengers had to leave. Some attempted to help Tim, but Lee threatened them with a knife, forcing them back. In a matter of moments, the ordinary hierarchy of the bus disappeared. The driver was no longer simply driving. The passengers were no longer simply passengers. They were witnesses, survivors, people trying to get away from a violent attack happening inside a confined space. Outside the bus, the passengers were separated from what was happening inside. The physical distance may have been only a few meters, but emotionally it must have felt enormous. They could not simply go back. They could not safely approach Lee. They could not reach Tim. The bus had become a barrier. Police were called. The RCMP began responding to the situation. The scene now had to be treated as a dangerous emergency. Lee remained inside. The passengers remained outside. And the vehicle itself became the center of the unfolding police operation. This is where the geography was not a private room where investigators could immediately enter and secure everything. It was a long, narrow passenger vehicle. There were seats. There was an aisle. There were doors. There were windows. There was limited room for movement. And inside that confined space was an armed suspect. Police therefore had to approach carefully. They could not simply assume that the danger had ended. They had to control the area. They had to protect the passengers. They had to determine what was happening inside. And they had to find a way to arrest Lee without creating additional casualties. The passengers, meanwhile, had become unwilling participants in a night they would never forget. They had boarded the bus as individuals. Now they stood together outside the vehicle, connected by the same terrifying experience. Some had seen the attack. Some had attempted to help. Some had only seen enough to realize that they needed to escape. But all of them had been inside the same moving vehicle when the ordinary journey suddenly became a murder scene. The bus itself would eventually become evidence. Investigators would examine it carefully. Every part of the physical environment mattered. Where people had been sitting, where the attack had begun, where passengers had moved. The physical setting could tell investigators what had happened even when the motives behind it remained unclear. But there was another kind of evidence that could not be photographed. The evidence of the mind. Why had Lee attacked him? Why had he remained on the bus? Why had he behaved in such an unusual way afterward? Why had he not simply fled? Those questions could not be answered by examining the seats or the windows. They required a different investigation. An investigation into Lee's psychological condition. That investigation would become crucial because the physical facts of the crime were never seriously disputed. Lee had killed Tim. The question was not whether the act had happened. The question was what Lee had understood when he committed it. Had he understood Tim to be an innocent human being? Had he understood the nature of what he was doing? Had he understood that his actions were wrong? Or had psychosis transformed the entire situation inside his mind? The answers would determine the legal path of the case. But on the night of July 30th, those questions were still far away. The immediate concern was simply to end the danger. Police surrounded the Greyhound. The passengers waited. Lee remained inside. The hours passed. Eventually, the standoff ended, and Lee was taken into custody. But the psychological consequences had only begun. They had been forced to leave a vehicle in which one of their fellow passengers had been killed. They would later have to describe what they had seen. They would have to speak with investigators. They would have to reconstruct moments that many people would desperately want to forget. For Tim's family, the consequences were even more permanent. There would be no return to normal. The bus journey had ended, but Tim would not be getting off at the next stop. He would not walk through the door at home. He would not return to the work that had taken him across Canada. He would not have the opportunity to continue the ordinary life that had been waiting for him. The physical setting of the crime, therefore, became inseparable from the loss. A highway. A Greyhound. A seat near the back. A pair of headphones. A stranger sitting beside a sleeping young man. These ordinary details would become part of the story of Tim McLean. And perhaps that is one of the most painful aspects of the case. Nothing about the environment announced what was coming. The bus did not look like a crime scene when Tim boarded it. It looked like transportation. The seat did not look dangerous. It was simply a seat. The man beside him did not come with a warning label. He was simply another passenger. The journey did not feel like the beginning trip, A road home. A few more hours. Then Winnipeg. That was the expectation. Instead, the Greyhound became the place where Tim's life ended. And because the setting was so ordinary, the case created a particularly disturbing realization for the public. There are places where people expect danger. A dark alley. A deserted building. A remote road. But a crowded public bus does not normally belong to that category. People enter such spaces believing that the presence of others provides protection. If something happens, someone will notice. If someone needs help, someone will intervene. If there is trouble, the driver can stop. Those assumptions are part of what makes public transportation possible. The events of July 30th shattered those assumptions for everyone on board. The passengers discovered that being surrounded by people does not necessarily mean being safe. Sometimes the danger can be sitting directly beside you. Sometimes the person next to you can be fighting a private battle that nobody else can see. And sometimes an ordinary journey can change forever in the space of a few seconds. For Tim, there would be no second chance. For the passengers, there would be memories. For the police, there would be an investigation. For psychiatrists, the mind of the man who had committed the killing. And for the courts, there would eventually be a question that went beyond the Greyhound itself. What does justice mean when the person responsible for a terrible act is suffering from a severe mental disorder? That question would take the case far beyond the Manitoba Highway. But the setting would always remain important. Because before the courtroom, there was the bus. Before the psychiatric assessments, there was the journey. Before the national debate over criminal responsibility, there was a 22-year-old man sitting near the back of a Greyhound, listening to music and waiting to get home. Tim had no reason to believe that the stranger beside him represented a threat. He had no reason to think that his journey was anything other than temporary. He had no reason to imagine that the next few hours would transform a normal bus ride into one of the most notorious criminal cases in Canadian history. The highway kept stretching toward Winnipeg. The passengers expected the journey to continue, and for a while it did. Then one passenger stood beside another. A knife appeared. The ordinary world disappeared. By the time the police arrived, the meaning of that bus had changed forever. It was no longer simply a vehicle carrying people toward home. It was the place where Tim McLean's final journey had struck not only what happened inside those few meters of space, but what had been happening inside the mind of the man sitting beside him. Long before the Greyhound stopped on the highway, before police lights surrounded the vehicle, before the name Tim McLean became known across Canada, there was another story unfolding quietly in the life of Vince Lee. It was a story that did not begin with a knife. It did not begin with a murder. And it did not begin on a bus. It began with a gradual separation between a man and the world around him. Vince Lee had come to Canada from China and eventually settled in Edmonton. From the outside, his life could appear ordinary enough. He worked, moved through communities, interacted with people, and attempted to build a life in a country far from where he had been born. But beneath that ordinary surface, serious problems were developing. Later psychiatric assessments would establish that Lee suffered from schizophrenia and that, by the time of the Greyhound killing, he was experiencing a profound psychotic episode. The evidence described a man whose understanding of reality had become increasingly distorted. That distinction is important. Mental illness does not automatically make someone violent. Most people living with schizophrenia are not violent toward others. But in Lee's particular case, the illness hallucinations, creating a psychological reality in which ordinary people and ordinary events could take on completely different meanings. The people around him could see a man. Lee could experience something else. And that difference would eventually have fatal consequences. In the weeks and days before the murder, there were signs that something was wrong. People who knew Lee noticed changes in his behavior. He appeared increasingly troubled. His thinking became unusual. He struggled with beliefs and fears that were difficult for others to understand. There were indications that he needed psychiatric help. But recognizing that someone is mentally unwell is not the same as knowing that a catastrophe is approaching. A person can behave strangely without anyone imagining murder. A person can talk about unusual beliefs without others understanding how deeply those beliefs have taken control. And when someone is losing contact with reality, The people around them may not immediately recognize the seriousness of what is happening. That was part of the tragedy surrounding Lee. The signs existed, but they did not form a clear warning that anyone could easily interpret. Meanwhile, Tim McLean was living a completely separate life. He was 22. He had been working. He was traveling. He had friends and family waiting. He was not someone who had contributed to Lee's problems. He was simply going home. That separation between their lives is crucial. The two men came together only because of a seat on a Greyhound. Their paths crossed for a matter of hours. But one man's psychological crisis would determine the fate of the other. Before the bus journey, Lee had already been experiencing a world that was increasingly difficult for him to distinguish from reality. He heard voices. According to later psychiatric testimony, he believed some of those voices were associated with God. They were not simply thoughts passing through his mind. He experienced them as real. That distinction may be difficult for someone who has never experienced psychosis to understand. Imagine hearing a voice when nobody is speaking. Imagine being completely convinced that the voice is real. Imagine believing that the voice carries authority. Then imagine that the voice begins telling you that someone near you represents a danger. To an outside observer, the conclusion may appear impossible. To the person experiencing the psychosis, it can feel undeniable. That is the world into which Tim unknowingly stepped. There was no visible boundary between Lee's internal reality and the physical environment. The bus was real. The passenger, but the meaning Lee attached to them was distorted. At some point, Tim became part of that distorted reality. According to the psychiatric evidence later presented in court, Lee believed that Tim was connected to something dangerous, something he understood through the framework of his delusions. He believed that he needed to protect himself, and that belief would eventually become stronger than the ordinary reality everyone else could see. The Greyhound, therefore, became more than a physical setting. It became the meeting point between two completely different realities. For Tim, it was a bus. For the other passengers, it was a bus. For the driver, it was a route that needed to be completed. For Lee, during his psychotic episode, the environment was becoming something else. Every movement could carry a hidden meaning. Every person could be interpreted through the logic of his delusions. And Tim, sleeping beside him, could be transformed in Lee's mind from an innocent passenger into a perceived threat. This is where the psychological dimension of the case becomes essential. There is a temptation, when discussing a crime this horrifying, to reduce the perpetrator to a single word. Monster. Killer. Madman. But those words do not explain what happened. They describe our emotional reaction that produced the behavior. The court would eventually need to understand that machinery. What was Lee thinking? What did he believe? Could he understand what he was doing? Could he understand that it was wrong? And most importantly, what was his mental state at the precise moment he attacked him? Those questions would become central to the case. But before the court could ask them, investigators had to reconstruct Lee's movements. And those movements contained clues. One of the most revealing details concerned the days immediately before the killing. Lee had been moving around Manitoba. He had spent time in Erickson. He had spent a night near a grocery store. A witness later described seeing him sitting upright during the early morning hours, apparently unable to sleep. It is an image that becomes disturbing only when viewed in hindsight. A man sitting alone through the night. The world around him quiet. The hours passing. His eyes open while other people slept. Nobody watching him could have known exactly what was happening inside his head. Nobody could have looked at him and predicted that within a short time, he would become the central figure in one of Canada's most disturbing criminal cases. The following morning, Lee sold a laptop computer. That detail would later become part of the evidence used to reconstruct his state of mind. The computer contained job applications, different kinds of jobs, different possibilities, different directions. The material suggested a man who had been thinking about employment and his future, but whose life lacked stability. There were also photographs and other files. Investigators examined these details after the murder. The computer was not simply an object. It became a window into the days leading up to the crime. And the more investigators learned, the more complicated the story became. There was no obvious conventional motive. There was no financial scheme. There was no secret relationship with Tim. There was no evidence that Lee had been planning a revenge killing against him. Instead, the evidence increasingly pointed toward a man whose behavior had become deeply influenced by mental illness. On July 30th, Lee boarded the Greyhound again. The bus continued through Manitoba. Eventually, he moved toward the rear, toward Tim. And once again, the ordinary and the extraordinary were about to collide. Tim had no reason to study the stranger beside him. He did not know Lee's history. He did not know about the voices. He did not know about the delusions. He did not know that the man's understanding of reality had become dangerously unstable. Tim was simply tired. He put on his headphones. Several minutes, perhaps longer, the bus continued normally. That image is worth holding on to because it represents the last moment when the journey still belonged to ordinary life. A sleeping passenger, a stranger sitting beside him, a road disappearing into the darkness outside. Other people quietly waiting for their destination. Nobody knew that the situation was about to become irreversible. Nobody could see the boundary between Lee's mind and reality collapsing. And then the attack began. The physical events were horrifying. But for this part of the story, what matters most is what they revealed. Lee's actions were not the result of a spontaneous argument. They were not a reaction to something Tim had done. They came from a psychological world in which Tim had acquired a meaning that did not exist outside Lee's mind. That was the central mystery. How could one human being look at another innocent person and perceive an enemy? The answer would eventually come through psychiatric examination. Doctors would study Lee. They would listen to his explanations. They would examine his history. They would compare his statements with the evidence from the scene. They would attempt to determine whether his account was consistent with genuine psychosis. And eventually, both the prosecution and defense would accept the psychiatric at the time of the killing. That agreement would have enormous consequences, because it meant the case would not follow the path that the public might expect. There would still be no dispute that Tim was dead. There would still be no dispute that Lee had caused his death. There would still be no dispute that the attack had been extraordinarily violent. But the law would have to ask a different question. Was Lee criminally responsible? The answer would depend not simply on what his hands had done, but on what his mind had been capable of understanding at that moment. That is a difficult distinction. For the family of a victim, the result of an act is concrete. A person is alive. Then they are gone. There is an empty chair. A phone that will never ring with their voice again. Clothes that will never be worn. Plans that will never happen. A future that has disappeared. The law, however, sometimes has to look into the mind of the person responsible and ask questions that grief cannot answer. Was he capable of knowing what he was doing? Did he understand that it was wrong? Was his perception of reality so severely distorted that the normal foundations of criminal responsibility had collapsed? These questions would eventually dominate the case. But before they reached the courtroom, there was the human cost. Tim's mother, Carol Dedeli, would be forced to confront a reality his son had left on a bus. He was supposed to return. Instead, the family received news of his death. And then came the details. The extraordinary circumstances, the stranger, the mental illness, the voices, the delusions, the possibility that the man responsible might not receive a conventional prison sentence. For a grieving family, these concepts could feel painfully abstract. Mental disorder is a clinical term. Not criminally responsible is a legal term. Neither phrase can describe the feeling of losing a child. Neither can explain what it means to know that someone you loved was killed by a stranger while simply trying to get home. This is why the story of Tim cannot be separated from the story of Lee. But neither should Tim disappear beneath Lee's story. The psychiatric case would eventually attract enormous public attention. People would debate Lee's illness. They would debate the legal system. They would debate public safety. They would debate whether a person responsible for such a horrific act could ever safely return to society. But every one of those debates began with the death of one person, Tim McLean. The setting was Manitoba. The vehicle was a Greyhound. The road was leading toward Winnipeg, and the moment was supposed to be the detail of all. Nothing about Tim's journey looked like the beginning of a crime story. It looked like the end of a work trip. It looked like a young man going home. The tragedy was not that Tim entered a place known to be dangerous. The tragedy was that danger entered the ordinary place where he believed he was simply traveling. The Greyhound had no warning signs. The highway had no warning signs. The seat beside him had no warning sign. And Vince Lee did not announce what was happening inside his mind. For everyone else, the journey continued according to the rules of normal life. For Lee, those rules were breaking apart. The difference between those two realities would soon become fatal. And once the bus stopped, the investigation would begin to pull apart every layer of the story. The police would reconstruct the route. Witnesses would describe what they saw. Investigators would examine the vehicle. Lee would be arrested. Psychiatrists would eventually examine him. And the courts would have to determine what responsibility means when a person's perception of reality has been profoundly altered by mental illness. But before any of those questions could be answered, one fact remained brutally simple. Tim McLean had boarded the Greyhound alive. He had sat beside a stranger. He had fallen asleep. Side continued toward the city. But Tim's journey had ended. The journey of understanding why had only begun, that be why the time the Greyhound continued east through Manitoba on July 30th, 2008, there was nothing about the journey that suggested it would become a crime scene. The passengers were still passengers. The driver was still driving. The road ahead was still leading toward Winnipeg. And somewhere among those ordinary travelers sat 22-year-old Tim McLean, a young man whose thoughts were probably occupied by the simple things that occupy a person's mind near the end of a long trip. How much longer? What would happen when he arrived? Who would he see? What would tomorrow look like? After working away from home, returning can carry a particular feeling. The destination is no longer just a place on a map. It becomes familiar faces, familiar streets, familiar rooms. It means leaving the temporary world of work and travel behind. Tim had spent time in Edmonton working in the carnival business. His life had involved movement, but movement was not the same thing as uncertainty. There was still a direction. He was going home. The Greyhound was taking him there. The vehicle itself was almost like a small moving room. The outside world passed by in fragments through the windows. During enormous distances. At night, much of that landscape disappeared into darkness. Inside the bus, the passengers existed in a different atmosphere. The overhead lights created a narrow, artificial world. Seats formed rows. Bags rested beneath feet or in overhead storage. People spoke quietly or remained silent. Some passengers slept. Others listened to music. The occasional movement of the bus became part of the background, something the mind gradually stopped noticing. This is what long-distance travel does. At first, every movement of the vehicle is noticeable. Then the body adapts. The road becomes a rhythm. The engine becomes background noise. The passing landscape becomes repetitive. People begin to surrender their attention to their own thoughts. Tim did exactly that. He put on his headphones. He settled into his seat. Eventually, he slept. And only a short distance away, another man was experiencing something entirely different. Vince Lee had not simply become another passenger. Inside his mind, the world was changing. The later psychiatric evidence would establish that Lee was suffering from schizophrenia and experiencing a severe psychotic episode. His mind was producing voices. Among those beliefs were ideas connected to God and supernatural danger. For someone outside that experience, such beliefs can sound impossible. But psychosis does not announce itself as fiction to the person experiencing it. That is one of the most difficult aspects of understanding this case. Lee did not simply decide to pretend that something was happening. According to the psychiatric evidence, his perception of reality had become severely distorted. The voices were real to him. The threat was real to him. The meaning he attached to Tim was real to him. The physical world remained unchanged, but the interpretation of that world had become profoundly different. That difference was invisible to the passengers around him. They saw Tim sleeping. They saw Lee sitting nearby. They saw a Greyhound moving through Manitoba. Nobody could see the psychological storm taking place inside one passenger's mind. And perhaps nobody had any reason to imagine it. This is important because, in retrospect, every ordinary detail of the journey can feel like a warning. The seat change, the conversation with another passenger, the movement toward the back, the fact that Lee eventually sat beside Tim. But at the time, these actions were not obviously threatening. People change seats, they move around, they look for more comfortable places to sit. There was no simple action that could have told the other passengers, "This man is about to kill someone." That warning never came. Tim had no opportunity to understand what was happening. The other passengers had no opportunity to intervene before the attack began. And Lee's internal reality remained hidden. The bus continued. The distance to Winnipeg became shorter. And somewhere inside that moving vehicle, the final minutes of Tim's ordinary life were passing. There is something deeply unsettling about imagining those minutes, because nothing dramatic was happening from Tim's perspective. He was not preparing for death. He was not saying goodbye. He was not writing a final message. He was simply traveling. A person can be only minutes away from a life-changing event without knowing it. That is true in accidents. It is true in natural disasters. It is true in sudden medical emergencies. And it was true for Tim. He could not see the future. Neither could anyone else on that bus. But Lee's condition had reached a point where his internal world was becoming stronger than the evidence in front of him. According to the later psychiatric evidence, he believed Tim was somehow connected to a threat. The precise psychological process stating, an innocent passenger became the target. There was no conventional motive. Tim had not done something that provoked the attack. He had not entered into a dispute. He had not threatened Lee. He had not even been engaged with him in any meaningful way. He was sleeping. That fact is one of the most painful details in the entire case. Tim's vulnerability came from the very thing that should have been safe. He was resting. He trusted the environment enough to close his eyes. And the person beside him was watching the world through a completely different reality. The moment of violence came at approximately 8:30 p.m. Lee attacked him with a knife. The peaceful rhythm of the journey disappeared almost instantly. Passengers reacted. The drivers stopped the bus. People began moving toward the exits. Some tried to help. Lee threatened them. The instinct to rescue Tim collided with the need to survive. The passengers were forced outside. For a brief period, the people who had been sitting together only moments earlier were suddenly divided into two groups. Outside were the survivors. Inside was Lee. And inside the bus was Tim. The passengers could not safely go back. They were forced to wait. The driver had stopped ordinary journey, had become the setting for an emergency. Police were called. The RCMP began moving toward the scene. The passengers waited for help. The bus itself stood as a physical barrier between them and the person they had watched attack Tim. The longer the standoff continued, the more surreal the situation became. A Greyhound bus is designed to keep moving. Its purpose is transportation. Its doors open at scheduled stops. People board. People leave. The driver follows a route. That night, the entire purpose of the vehicle was suspended. It was no longer moving toward Winnipeg. It was surrounded by police. The passengers were no longer thinking about their destination. They were thinking about survival. Inside, Lee remained. And as police officers approached, they had to consider the possibility that the situation was still dangerous. They did not know exactly what Lee might do next. They did not know whether there were other victims. They could not assume that the violence was finished simply because the bus had stopped. The police response, therefore, had to be careful. The passengers had already escaped. The next task was to secure the suspect. Eventually, after hours of uncertainty, Lee was taken into custody. The physical emerging. Investigators entered a scene unlike anything they expected to encounter during an ordinary highway call. The Greyhound was no longer a vehicle. It was evidence. Every seat mattered. Every movement mattered. Every witness mattered. The passengers would have to explain what they had seen. The driver would have to describe the sequence of events. Investigators would reconstruct Lee's movements. They would determine when he changed seats, where he sat, how the attack began, how the passengers escaped. how the police response unfolded. And then they would begin asking the question that could not be answered simply by examining the bus. Why? Why did Vince Lee attack Tim McLean? The physical evidence could establish what happened, but it could not explain the mind behind it. That would require another kind of investigation. The investigators would learn that Lee had been behaving strangely before the murder. He had been traveling through Manitoba. He had spent time in Erickson. He had apparently spent a night without sleeping. He had sold a laptop. His computer contained job applications and photographs. These details did not immediately create a complete explanation, but together, they began forming a picture of instability. The more investigators looked backward, the more disconnected, and eventually, the focus turned towards psychiatric history. What had happened to Lee before July 30th? Had anyone recognized how seriously ill he was? Had there been opportunities for intervention? What exactly was happening in his mind during the journey? Those questions would become critical, but they were not questions that could be answered in one interview. Psychiatrists would have to examine Lee. They would have to listen to his descriptions of voices and beliefs. They would have to determine whether his account matched the behavior witnessed by others. They would have to distinguish genuine psychosis from an attempt to avoid responsibility. And eventually, the evidence would point toward a conclusion that would change the entire legal direction of the case. Lee was suffering from schizophrenia. He had been psychotic, and his perception of Tim had been shaped by that illness. The legal consequences would be extraordinary. Instead of a conventional murder trial focused primarily on proving the act, the central issue would become Lee's mental state. Could a man who had killed another person be found not criminally responsible because his mind was so severely disordered that he could not understand the moral and legal wrongfulness of his actions? That question was still months away. On the night of July 30th, there was only grief, not becoming home. The passengers were beginning to understand that the journey they had expected to forget as soon as they reached Winnipeg would instead become one of the defining experiences of their lives. And investigators were beginning the painstaking process of turning a chaotic scene into a sequence of facts. The bus had stopped. The suspect had been arrested. The victim had been identified. The country would soon learn the name Tim McLean. But behind every headline was a family trying to understand how an ordinary journey could have ended in such extraordinary violence. There is often a temptation in true crime to focus on the moment of violence because it is the moment when everything changes. But the story of Tim McLean did not truly begin with the knife. It began with the expectation that nothing would happen. That is the foundation of the tragedy. Tim did not board the Greyhound because he believed he was taking a risk. He boarded because he believed he was traveling. He did not sit beside Lee because he wanted to meet him. He simply happened to be there. He did not fall asleep because he had forgotten about danger. He fell asleep because he believed he was safe enough to rest. And that ordinary trust became part of what made the crime so shocking. The Greyhound was carrying people toward their destinations. Tim's destination was home. For the others, but after the attack, every passenger's destination changed. They were taken away from the bus. They were interviewed. They became witnesses. They carried memories of the night with them. The Greyhound would eventually be examined as a crime scene, and the road itself would become permanently connected to the name Tim McLean. For his family, however, geography mattered far less than absence. There would be no Tim arriving home, no footsteps, no conversation, no ordinary continuation of the life he had been living. Instead, there would be photographs, memories, questions, and years of trying to understand. And as the legal process unfolded, the family would have to hear the story repeatedly. They would hear about the attack. They would hear about Lee's mental state. They would hear about schizophrenia. They would hear the words, "not criminally responsible." And each new stage would force them to revisit the same loss. That is one of the cruelest realities of a high-profile criminal case. For the public, the case eventually becomes history. For investigators, the files are eventually closed. For lawyers, the arguments eventually end. For journalists, the story eventually moves out of the headlines. But for the victim's family, this is personal. Tim does not become a case from 2008. He remains Tim, the young man who left, the son who was supposed to return. the friend who should still have been alive. That human reality would remain at the center of the story even as the legal questions became more complicated. The country would soon have to decide what justice meant in this particular case. But justice could not recreate the missing years. It could not return Tim to his family. It could only determine how society should respond to the man who had killed him. And that distinction would become the source of enormous public debate. For now, however, the Greyhound sat in darkness. The road toward Winnipeg continued beyond it. The passengers had escaped. The police had arrived. The suspect was in custody. The physical crime had ended. But the invisible story had just begun. Investigators would soon enter the mind of Vince Lee through interviews, medical records, and psychiatric assessments. They would discover a world of voices and delusions. They would learn that the man sitting beside Tim had not been seeing the same reality as everyone else. And eventually, they would confront a question that still has no easy answer. If a person's mind becomes so severely distorted that an innocent man's responsibility begin, and where does illness end? The answer would determine the fate of Vince Lee. But it could never change the fate of Tim McLean. He had boarded the bus alive. He had been traveling home. He had fallen asleep beside a stranger. And before the journey could reach Winnipeg, his life had ended. The road kept going. Tim did not. Before Tim McLean became the name attached to one of Canada's most disturbing criminal cases, he was simply a young man trying to build a life. He was 22 years old. That number is easy to say and easy to write, but it carries a different weight when attached to a life that has suddenly ended. 22 means there are supposed to be years ahead. There are supposed to be decisions still waiting to be made, places still waiting to be visited, relationships that have not yet begun, mistakes that have not yet happened, and ordinary mornings that have not yet arrived. At 22, a person's story is usually still being written. Tim's was not finished. It was taken from him. To understand the tragedy of what happened on the Greyhound, it is important to move away from the image that later dominated the headlines. The sleeping passenger, the bus, the attack, the crime scene. Before all of that, there was Tim. There was a son. There was a friend. There was a young man, not extraordinary in the way newspapers usually define extraordinary. And perhaps that is precisely why his death was so difficult for people to comprehend. Tim was not looking for danger. He was not involved in a feud. He was not knowingly entering a violent situation. He was simply returning home. The details of his life matter because a victim should never become nothing more than the worst thing that happened to them. A photograph of Tim cannot show the future he should have had. A newspaper headline cannot show the conversations he would have had with his family. A courtroom transcript cannot capture the ordinary personality of a young man who was loved by people who knew him long before his name became associated with tragedy. Those closest to Tim remembered him as someone who was easygoing. One friend who had known him since grade 7 later recalled that he could not remember Tim ever getting into a fight. That small observation tells us more about Tim than a dramatic description ever could. He was not remembered as someone constantly searching for confrontation. He was not someone whose life revolved around violence. He was simply Tim, the kind of person whose friends could remember him across years of growing up, the kind of friend whose personality became part of the background of ordinary life. School, conversations, plans, the small experiences that seem unimportant while they are happening but become precious after someone is gone. Tim had also developed a working life connected to the carnival business. That meant movement. It meant traveling from place to place. It meant temporary work and long stretches away from the familiarity of home. There is something distinctive about people who work in traveling carnivals. Their lives are built around movement in a way that most people never experience. One town ends. Another begins. Equipment is packed. The fairground disappears. The group moves on. The work itself becomes a cycle of arrival and departure. For a young man, that kind of life can offer adventure and independence. It can also create a strong awareness of home. After spending time on the road, returning to familiar people can feel different. The journey back is not simply transportation. It is the final step before re-entering the life waiting for you. That was the direction Tim was traveling when he boarded the Greyhound. Home. Winnipeg. The people who knew him were waiting for his return. There is no evidence that Tim believed anything extraordinary was about to happen. There was no ordinary life. He had traveled before. He understood what a long-distance journey meant. Find a seat. Put your belongings away. Listen to music. Watch the scenery. Talk to another passenger if the opportunity arises. Sleep when tired. Wait for the destination. There is something almost painfully ordinary about those actions. That is why the final photograph of Tim alive is so difficult to separate from what happened afterward. He was still himself, still 22, still part of a family, still part of friendships, still part of a future. The future is something people at 22 tend to take for granted, not because they are careless, but because the human mind naturally assumes tomorrow will arrive. A young person thinks about next month, next year, the next job, the next relationship, the next trip. There is always another chapter. For Tim, the final chapter came without warning. His family would eventually be forced to reconstruct the final hours of his life through the testimony of strangers. That is an especially painful experience. A family knows the ordinary version of a person. They know how he looked when he woke up. They know what he was like when he was irritated. They know his habits. They know the stories that would him that existed before tragedy. Then, suddenly, strangers begin telling them about his final moments. A bus driver, passengers, police officers, investigators, psychiatrists, lawyers. Each person contributes another piece, but none of them can provide the thing the family most wants. More time. That is the cruelty of sudden death. There is no gradual goodbye, no final conversation in which both people understand that it is the last one, no opportunity to say everything that should have been said. The last moments are ordinary because nobody knows they are the last. Tim did not know that when he boarded the bus. His family did not know that when he left. His friends did not know, and the ordinary nature of that departure would later make it even harder to accept. There was no warning, no dramatic final scene. No indication that the next time they would hear about Tim, it would be because he had been murdered. The news would arrive as news like this always arrives. Suddenly. And then everything before it would be divided into two categories. Before Tim died. After Tim died. For those who loved him, the world would never again be exactly the same. His age would become still young enough to be described as having his whole life ahead of him. Old enough to have begun building an independent life. Young enough that the future should have remained open. And yet, on a Manitoba highway, that future disappeared. The physical circumstances of his death were extraordinarily violent, but Tim's life should not be remembered only through violence. He had spent time working. He had friends. He had family. He had ambitions, even if they were still developing. He had the ordinary imperfections and uncertainties of a young person. He was not a symbol. He was not a statistic. He was a person. That distinction becomes especially important when examining what happened afterward. The case became nationally known. The name Vince Lee appeared repeatedly in the news. Psychiatric evidence became the subject of public discussion. The phrase "not criminally responsible" became familiar to people who had never previously encountered it. Canadians debated mental illness, public safety, and the justice system. But behind all of those debates was Tim. Without him, there would have been no case, no courtroom battle, no national discussion, no years of legal and psychiatric proceedings. The entire chain began with the death of one young man. That his final journey began as a return home. He had been away working. He was traveling east. The bus moved through Manitoba. At some point, he sat beside Vince Lee. The two men had no meaningful history together. They were strangers. Tim could not have known that Lee was suffering from a severe psychiatric disorder. He could not have known that Lee was hearing voices. He could not have known that Lee's mind had begun constructing a reality in which Tim would eventually become a perceived threat. Tim had no reason to know any of this. There was no responsibility on his part to detect another person's illness. He was a passenger. Nothing more. And yet, his position on that bus would determine everything. The final hours of Tim's life were therefore marked by a painful contradiction. He was physically surrounded by other people, but in the moment that mattered most, he was completely alone with the person who attacked him. The other passengers were nearby, but they could not understand what was about to happen. The driver was nearby, but he could not see inside Lee's mind. Nobody could. Tim was asleep. His headphones separated him from the conversations and movements around him. He was in his own small world. Perhaps he was thinking about home, no particular thoughts at all. That is one of the things we can never know, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the case so haunting. When a person's life ends suddenly, the surviving world begins searching for meaning in tiny details. What was the last thing he ate? Who did he speak to? What was he thinking? Was he happy? Was he worried? Did he have any idea